Good evening, everyone. I'm Kirsten Rioch, guest curator for the Malkin Lecture Series at the Park Avenue Armory. This ongoing series is now in its 19th year and includes lectures and conversations relating to the political, social, and artistic life of late 19th to early 20th America. I'm happy to welcome you all to the final talk of our 2025 season. And if you haven't checked out the Armory's 2026 artistic programming season, it just has come out. There are flyers outside, and you can check it out online. At this time, I'm going to ask that you all just check your cell phones and silence them, and note any exits from the room. I'm thrilled tonight to introduce Sara Zewde, founding design principal of Studio Zewde, a design firm practicing landscape architecture, urbanism, and public art. In parallel to her design practice, Sara serves as associate professor in practice of landscape architecture at Harvard University, and is currently writing a book. Well, no, I shouldn't say that. As of today, has finished a book on her research, retracing Frederick Law Olmsted's journeys through the slave South. And tonight, she'll explore selections from her research, focusing on this lesser-known body of Olmsted's work. It's tempting to think of him primarily as an urban parks and planning, figure who is so central to our identity here in New York City. But we're going to learn about his wider interests and his work tonight, and his identity as an abolitionist, as a conservationist, and so much more. So I'm very excited for tonight, and please join me in welcoming Sara Zewde.
Good evening. Thank you all for having me this evening. As was mentioned, I submitted my manuscript 2 hours ago. So welcome to my celebration party. Perhaps, as you all know, it's debatable, but perhaps more than any single person in history, Frederick Law Olmsted shaped the way America looks. Known as the founding father of American landscape architecture and the designer of North America's quintessential parks, Olmsted influences the everyday life of our cities and towns. Our very own Central Park, Boston's Emerald Necklace, San Francisco's Golden Gate Park, the U.S. Capitol grounds, Brooklyn's Prospect Park are but a sample of the beloved places Olmsted advocated for and designed. His firm, which continued his work after his passing in 1903, would go on to take part in some 5,500 projects from 1857 to 1961. Memorialized in over 30 biographies, he is one of the most written about figures in all of American history. So 200 years after his birth, what more could there possibly be to say about Frederick Law Olmsted? While Olmsted is widely celebrated for his park making, a key part of his biography is much lesser known, a part that has profound implications for how we understand America and its civic ground, past, present, and future. In 1852, the New York Daily Times commissioned a 30-year-old Frederick Law Olmsted to conduct an immersive research journey through the southern slave states. For 14 months, across 2 separate journeys, Olmsted wrote contemporaneously on the economic, political, and environmental conditions of the slave South, writing that would become vital to global abolition movements. His extensive documentation of antebellum America makes him widely considered among historians as the most cited witness of 19th century slavery in the United States, and is writing an invaluable historical document that significantly shapes history's view of this era. My research looks at how those 14 months of travel, of documenting slavery's corrosive impact on society, inspired in him the radical idea that public parks could redress America's ills. For Olmsted, this was exemplified in the northern urban centers that raised him, where free labor, public investment in a constellation of institutions and infrastructures, and a commitment to parks and public spaces were critically intertwined. This journey through the so-called Cotton Kingdom became a centerpiece of his inspiration, methods, and legacy as a landscape architect, and to the landscapes that across America he shaped. So towards the end of his journey, it was 1854. By the time Frederick Law Olmsted entered the mouth of Lake Pontchartrain by steamboat, the last portion of his trip through the southern slave states, he departed Alabama's Mobile Bay and traveled along the Mississippi Sound, a long, narrow body of water shielded by barrier islands and protected from the deeper, more volatile Gulf waters. From the Gulf, the steamboat entered the Wrigley's, a narrow, natural strait threading the bayous of southeast Louisiana, and he skirted the northern rim of Lake Pontchartrain before finally turning into the open water in the direction of New Orleans for his final major stop on this trip. At the time of Olmsted's visit in Louisiana, this man, a man named John Slidell, had just been elected to the U.S. Senate to represent Louisiana, and he was sent by his electorate to cast his vote with other pro-slavery congressmen to repeal the Missouri Compromise, acquire Cuba, and admit Kansas as a slave state. Following secession, John Slidell would go on to serve as the Confederacy's ambassador to France under Confederate President Jefferson Davis. And in 1888, a town was formed there on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain where Olmsted had passed. And the town would be named Slidell, Louisiana, in honor of the staunch advocate of slavery. I am flooded with pleasant memories when I reflect on my childhood growing up in Slidell, Louisiana. And the many hours and days spent at John Slidell Park are undoubtedly a predominant influence in my own personal journey to finding a profession in landscape architecture. So for me, the story of Olmsted in the South starts here, in part because I should make the distinction between, I should basically admit to you all that I'm not an actual scholar. I'm not a historian. I am a Black woman who was born and raised in the South, who became a landscape architect. And over time, I grew increasingly curious about the relationship between Olmsted's journey south and his practice in my own profession. So in 2018, I quit my job as a landscape architect to retrace Olmsted's steps across Cotton Kingdom. I pieced together some research grants to sustain me, got a rental car, a litany of Airbnb reservations, a cross-country tour of regrettable fast food choices. But before hitting the road, I wanted to first investigate what led up to Olmsted's trip south, how had slavery shaped his early life, what were his views on slavery before his journey, and in what ways did his views change as a result of the trip. I decided my journey would begin with a stay in Washington, D.C. as a research fellow at Dumbarton Oaks. And here I would spend 4 months poring through Olmsted's personal letters and archives, searching for the answers to these questions. I was shocked to come to get to know young Olmsted through his letters. Born in 1822, he came of age in the midst of a country's feverish cotton boom. Wide-eyed and curious about his tumultuously changing world, Olmsted grappled through his youth and young adulthood with the central question facing the society: slavery. In correspondence with friends and family, he frequently debated the issue, and these interests would eventually propel his travel around the world in his 20s and develop the expository writing style he later employed in the South. While Olmsted understood his visits to the South as his first encounters in Cotton Kingdom, like a fish unable to see its waters, he didn't recognize that his own early life had been shaped by it. The triangular trade from the late 16th to the early 19th century was central to the Connecticut River Valley economy, where the Olmsteds played a prominent role since settling in the region in 1632. After moving from Massachusetts to Connecticut in 1636, the Olmsteds quickly positioned themselves within this trade network. For 7 generations, they engaged as merchants, traders, farmers, seamen, and ship owners, exploiting nearly every facet of this system. And families like theirs connected slavery to northern industry, collecting produce from local farmers, shipping to Caribbean slave plantations, returning with sugar, molasses, and rum produced by enslaved labor. Frederick formed a close bond with his granduncle Gideon Olmsted, a sea captain who traveled to the West Indies, where enslaved Africans worked on sugar plantations. Gideon returned with cargoes of molasses for Connecticut markets, and even gifted Frederick Law a cane he would keep for life. The wealth from this transatlantic trade supported Olmsted's upbringing. His father, John Olmsted, ran a successful dry goods store stocked with global commodities, including cotton. During Frederick's youth, roughly 70% of Southern cotton was sold to the North, and when John died, he left an estate equivalent to $3.5 million to his children today. This merchant class of which the Olmsteds were a part was the mediating bridge between the slave plantations of the South, the West Indies, and South America, and the industrial capitalism of New England and Europe. While one half of this mediation became the focus of moral condemnation among abolitionists, including eventually Frederick himself, the two worlds were in reality fused together. On the very precipice of the 40-year cotton boom from roughly 1820 to 1860, depending on the start of the Civil War, Frederick Law was born to Charlotte Law and John Olmsted of Hartford, Connecticut, and his formative years would unfold with the backdrop of some of the country's most significant historical moments. Young Olmsted, like the cotton plant itself, would grow expansively in those 40 years. So my research really began, this was a hypothesis originally to, chronologically looking at the relationship between his writing and his travel with his practice of landscape architecture. The hypothesis was, is there a relationship? Was there an influence? And so starting to investigate that became just putting the dates on a timeline. So what you're looking at here in this graphic are the dates roughly associated with his work as a journalist and as a writer broadly on topics of slavery. And here in green, we're looking at key dates around his career as a landscape architect. Broadly speaking, his biography is understood as kind of two subsequent distinct chapters of his biography. He was a young wayward who didn't know what he wanted to do. He was writing, he was trying all these different careers, and then he found his way to landscape architecture. But when we put the dates together, what we start to see is that he's actually going back and forth between his writing, his travels in the South, and his practice of landscape architecture. And from here, we can really start to understand that these were actually part of the same project in his mind. And throughout these 40 years of the cotton boom that I'm really focused on, from his birth in 1822 to really the end of the Civil War, we see references to these historical moments that really drive his thinking, both in his writing and in his practice. And, I'm not the first person to say this. Charlie Beveridge himself writes that, who's the world's foremost Olmsted scholar, writes that although Olmsted changed in 5 years from a farmer to a writer and publisher, and then to park designer and administrator, the single problem of slavery dominated his thinking and gave unity to his various activities. A month after Olmsted's first book on his travels through England was published, a family friend and fellow Hartfordite, Harriet Beecher Stowe, published her anti-slavery novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Almost immediately, the book reshaped attitudes towards slavery in the U.S. Shortly thereafter, Olmsted's close mate, Charles Loring Brace, recommended Olmsted for the position of traveling correspondent for Raymond's new daily paper. Raymond, an anti-slavery advocate himself, had established the paper with an editorial slant towards abolition. Yet in the single meeting between Raymond and Olmsted before he was hired, Raymond did not ask Olmsted's views on slavery or any topic. The request from Raymond was simply to write about his personal observations traveling through the South, stating in fact no requirement to reinforce the paper's position. It is as if Raymond knew, based on Olmsted's writing across England and the conditions in the South, that Olmsted's written observations could be revelatory for both Olmsted and the readership. Finally, in 1852, he departed for the South. Olmsted's series in the New York Daily Times caused a stir, sparking backlash from the Southern press and provoking debate. He was writing anonymously. The Savannah Republican complained, "The Times sends a stranger among us to spy out the nakedness of the land. What is its object, if it be not an evil one?" The stir pleased Henry Raymond, as Olmsted's column helped to establish the Times' voice and place it in the emerging market of daily newspaper journalism. In the middle of his 2 trips south, Olmsted attended a critical convening of the Colored National Convention, part of a series of assemblies of free black people across the U.S. from the 1830s into the 1860s that functioned as a public square for the writers, ministers, politicians, entrepreneurs, and people from all walks of life excluded from mainstream public political discourse. The 1853 session, convened by Frederick Douglass and his contemporaries, marked a pivotal moment in antebellum black civic organizing, where assertions of African Americans as full American citizens were expressed, shared visions for education and economic empowerment formed, and a stand against repatriation to Africa clarified, signaling a commitment to the United States and laying the groundwork for the long arc of civil rights activism in the decades ahead. Douglass himself delivered a compelling address that shaped the discourse of the convening, and abolition was the main and urgent goal. Olmsted shared in his writing a lengthy reflection on what he witnessed in Rochester. Quote, "While we are questioning the possible development of the Negro race to an intellectual equality with their own, there meets voluntarily and at the suggestion of themselves, without any aid or publicly expressed countenance or encouragement of a white man, a large congress of men of this race. It may be doubted if there has ever met a convention of white men in our country in which more common sense, more talent, more power of eloquence, a higher civilization, more manliness, or more of the virtues and graces of the Christian and the gentleman were evidenced than in that convention of the despised Northern Negroes." End quote. Shortly thereafter, Olmsted began writing 3 concluding letters for his series in the Times. Perhaps nowhere is the impact of his time in the South more evident than his writing here. His central conclusion was that while slavery's damage to the enslaved was in a sense undeniable, its broader effects on the broader civic society were even more pernicious to American democracy. He described these influences as moral, intellectual, and material. Olmsted argued morally that civic engagement required a shared moral foundation, yet slave society lacked a fundamental sense of right. Routine violence and cruelty on plantations had, he believed, eroded Southern white citizens' regard for both enslaved people's lives and even each other's, distorting the moral compass necessary for democratic participation. For him, intellectually, civic discourse had been warped by relations that were based on ownership. Because white Southerners interacted mainly with those they owned, dominated, or subjugated, they became less capable of engaging dissenting ideas and closed their minds, quote, "to all opinions and schemes to which he had been bred a stranger," end quote. A slaveholding society, he wrote, had, quote, "less curiosity, less originating genius, less inventive, less patient and persevering energy," end quote. The elite resisted education for both whites and blacks and clung to ignorance as a means of preserving their supremacy. Their repression of intellect, Olmsted warned, was incompatible with the needs of a functioning democracy. Materially, Olmsted found slavery economically and environmentally ruinous. Forced labor lowered skill and productivity, producing hidden inefficiencies and depressing wages for free workers. Landless whites became, quote, "unambitious, degraded, and illiterate, a dead peasantry," end quote. Soil exhaustion, erosion, and monoculture followed from the plantation system. Yet Southern whites, intoxicated by domination or by notions of superiority, remained blind to the damage and unable to make sound collective decisions about material resources. Following these conclusions, Olmsted believed democracy could recover only by rebuilding social life. Quote, "The only conclusion is perhaps this, that there need to be places and times for reunions, so attractive that the rich and the poor shall be attracted and encouraged to assimilate," end quote. Public parks, he argued, could counter, quote, "that excessive materialism of purpose in which we are so cursedly absorbed and function as friendly meeting ground." His final entry to the New York Daily Times, titled Number 48, The Last, offered his most comprehensive critique of slavery's moral and political bearings. Quote, "I believe the soul and mind suffer in slavery," he wrote, calling it shamefully cruel, selfish and wicked, and wholly inexcusable. No institution, he argued, so darkens the evangelical light of Christ, so obstructs the path of civilization, or so hideously distorts just democracy, end quote. While the harm to the enslaved was profound, he warned that slavery's damage to the nation's moral, intellectual, and material advancement was even more entrenched. Ending it would require sacrifice. Quote, "As slavery was based on injustice, it can hardly come to an end without injustice. The advantage of the mass will have to be secured by the suffering of individuals," end quote. By the close of this entry, his appeal was directed squarely, not at the South, but at the North. Quote, "The North has a duty, directly tending to the abolition of slavery, to deal justly and mercifully with the colored people in our midst." His final charge carried unmistakable urgency. The North must demonstrate that the Negro is endowed with the natural capacities to make a good use of the blessing of freedom. Let all who do not think slavery right demand fair play for the Negro. And you can see it here in all caps and underlined, the end. The year of 1857 is something of a culminating year in the story of Olmsted, slavery, and landscape architecture. Olmsted's journey south had launched his rabid dedication to the anti-slavery cause, one that was intensifying year over year since his initial departure south in 1852. Now, 5 years since his dedicated focus on slavery in the South, the year of 1857 saw Olmsted's most concentrated period of anti-slavery activism, with his most focused period of writing on the South and his most determined and militant engagement in opposing the spread of slavery. By the end of the same year, he would also be designing Central Park. The intensity of Olmsted's various anti-slavery activities dovetailed directly into the intensity he committed to the Central Park design competition in the fall of 1857. Over 5 years of reflection on labor, land, and the American body politic pressing on his conscience, the task in front of him was not to design a nice park. It was to design a piece of the civilization he sought for America to be. Rather than debate advocates of slavery on the merits of a free society, an endeavor he now understood as futile, he now sought the possibility of design as a tool for communicating his ideas visually, viscerally, and somatically. The proposal represented a proving ground, and the design's success or failure would either prove or disprove his arguments for freedom. For Olmsted and Vaux, his partner on the project, this manifested in a number of formal principles rooted in his political convictions that would become enshrined in the design for Central Park and consequently for America's public parks. Two landscape traditions dominated the mid-19th century, the European formal garden and the English picturesque. Nearly half of the 33 competition entries for Central Park reflected the English picturesque, which was kind of the emerging style of the day. And in that way, Olmsted and Vaux's proposal didn't distinguish itself in terms of style, but it did so by the scale of its ambition. Olmsted and Vaux proposed a transformation of unprecedented scale, a complete regrading, removal of millions of cubic feet of soil, heavy blasting, and the installation of millions of plants. For a time, Central Park was New York's biggest employer. Though many politicians sought to cut it back, Olmsted defended this scale as necessary to fulfilling the park's democratic purpose. Olmsted's outsized ambition for the project mirrored the urgency of his anti-slavery convictions. He believed the country itself required major reconstruction from the ground up, and the park was both a symbol and an instrument of this renewal. Moreover, the park's 840 acres removed from private speculation, held in trust, and publicly financed, constituted a new institution of civic life. Unlike the plazas and squares, it had the capacity to gather a full cross-section of the city. Olmsted and Vaux planned with long-range vision, anticipating a future metropolis, new transit lines, the expansion of northern neighborhoods like Harlem. They saw the park as urban infrastructure and an engine of social cohesion. Olmsted and Vaux's plan rejected as much as possible what they believed were aristocratic and urban forms: monumental centers, axial promenades, formal gardens, anything recalling hierarchy or royal display. The city represented the oppressive forces, its sorting of people, its pollution, its relentless discipline. The park was an antidote to the city. They sought immersion in landscape and a human scale, designing for the, quote, common person, whom they saw as the park's rightful owner. The pastoral held democratic meaning. They described their work as, quote, translating democratic ideas into trees and dirt. Views were political instruments. The sensation of freedom, Vaux wrote, commands a boundless prospect. Vaux famously says, quote, nature first, second, and third, architecture after a while. Trees ringed the park to conceal the surrounding city. Monuments, which Olmsted derided as incidents, were discouraged or concealed. The circulation system further embodied their philosophy. Entrances drew visitors quickly away from the city edges. Inside, meandering paths countered the efficient logic of the grid. These paths separated pedestrians, riders, and carriages to allow for quiet wandering. The plan's defining innovation, and perhaps why it won, was the sunken transverses, 4 crosstown routes buried in landscaped trenches, allowing city traffic to move unobtrusively beneath pastoral scenery. The success of this strategy remains evident today. The transverses barely register in our experience of the park. In the politics of the 19th century, recreation was not neutral. Pro-slavery elites argued that labor degraded a person's capacity for civic participation. A park in which all classes could recreate publicly countered that claim. Olmsted envisioned, quote, healthful recreation for the poor and the rich, end quote, giving the working class access to the restorative effects of nature. Passive recreation, strolling, resting, gathering was prioritized. Required programs like sports fields were confined and screened so that broad, flexible landscapes could support an overlapping mix of uses. Olmsted insisted on guiding not only design but construction, as well as its subsequent administration. So he oversaw thousands of laborers at a moment when pro-slavery politicians were obstructing civic investment nationwide. Its construction by free labor directly countered the claim that great works depended on slavery. On December 11, 1858, the park opened its first phase, and it was an immediate and epic success. Olmsted believed strongly in a passive approach to policing, and that a hostile demeanor towards the public would be counterproductive to its ability to serve as a civic and democratic space. He desired instead for the park's police force to serve as community outreach rather than law enforcement. And he even made up a quiz of fun facts and trivia about the park to ensure officers were knowledgeable about the park and could support this posture towards the public. Despite his continued work and engagement at Central Park, on November 6, 1860, there was a precipitating event in our nation's history that led to the end of Olmsted's work at Central Park. Anybody want to take a guess what happened on November 6, 1860? Lincoln won the election. It wasn't a mandate. He received the highest number of popular and electoral votes, but 60% of voters voted for one of the 3 pro-slavery candidates. So the vote was split, enabling Lincoln's victory. Olmsted saw the moral and political crisis unfolding after the election. By December 8, 1860, Olmsted wrote to a friend, quote, "We intend to have 2 republics, peaceably if we can, fighting if we must. My mind is made up for a fight," end quote. South Carolina then seceded on December 20, followed rapidly by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, forming the Confederate States of America. In the middle of this upheaval, Olmsted resigned from his work at Central Park on January 22, 1861. His resignation letter cited his frustration with his limited authority on the ongoing construction, but his personal letters reveal something else, a sense of civic duty and his commitment to the anti-slavery cause. By February 12, he had already begun a collaboration with a North Carolina abolitionist, editor, journalist named Daniel Goodloe to condense the writing that he'd done for the New York Times and in a Southern trilogy into a singular volume called Cotton Kingdom. He aimed to influence the crisis with urgency. As secession advanced and the war loomed, Olmsted trained a Central Park home guard here in the park, about 100 people, and explored volunteering himself for the Navy. The bombardment of Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, of course, marked the start of the Civil War. The states continued to join the Confederacy, which deepened Olmsted's resolve. He channeled his energy and advocacy for structural support for newly emancipated people, pushing for federal oversight. This is something that I go into more into my book, and I'm happy to answer more questions about it in the Q&A, but as enslaved people became free with the advance of Union troops, Olmsted was chiefly concerned with a process of support, a role for the federal government to support their transition into freedom, pitching himself as the leader of a Freedmen's Bureau. This was 3 years before the establishment, ultimately, of the Freedmen's Bureau. So his ideas foreshadowed the Freedmen's Bureau, and actually subsequently a number of private organizations run by charities asked for him to lead their organizations, but he he actually declined all of those offers because he believed that the federal government specifically should be leading the charge, and he grew very frustrated with the lack of resolve from the federal government. All of this to say that 1865 really marks the start of his storied career in landscape architecture. It's the end of the Civil War and the start of most biographies of Central Park's professional career. But in my telling, 1865 is the place where I close my story. The rest has been told. My mission, my driving question was to understand what set him on his path, what drove him, what propelled him to accomplish all that he did. My story was about his journey to landscape architecture and about my own journey discovering his. This is a drawing that he produced together with Daniel Goodloe in the 1861 rewriting into the singular volume of the Cotton Kingdom. And this is using, and they tried to use 1860 census data, but Goodloe felt like it was poorly organized. So they used 1850 census data to basically make a visual that would summarize the main argument of the text. And that was to challenge the economic argument of slavery. So here what they're doing is they decided to map out the concentration of enslaved labor and the productivity of the harvesting of cotton. And what they found essentially was that there was an inverse relationship. And so Olmsted was really committed to challenging the economic argument of slavery and pointing to the kind of intoxication is the word that he uses, that had taken over white Southerners, slaveholders, their inability to actually see the inefficiencies of slave labor. In working through all of this research, of course, Olmsted's last words in the Times that I shared with you echoed in my ears: fair play for the Negro. There's no misunderestimating his emphasis. A single phrase, underlined, punctuated in all caps, signing off months of reckoning, all culminating in the dramatic statement. That black people inherently lacked the capacity to self-determine was one of the key arguments made to uphold slavery. The ultimate counter-argument, he professed, was in the construction of a society that demonstrated the Negro's natural capacities through fair play for the Negro. This, to Olmsted, was the North's chief duty. Well, Seneca Village was just that kind of demonstration. On the land roughly between 81st and 89th Streets stood a momentous land-owning, free black community founded in the early 19th century, a time in the state of New York when slavery was still legal. In fact, it was one of the rarest instances of concentrated black land ownership in the antebellum North and a powerful early example of black-led urban community development. With the security of land tenure, Seneca Village became a version of the society Olmsted envisioned. A rooted community held together by a rich web of social interconnection, anchored by the landscape they shared, and animated by the institutions they built. It offered a radical model of black self-determination when otherwise such possibilities were systematically denied. Not exactly fair play for the Negro to remove this community. Seneca Village was forcibly removed to make Central Park, Olmsted's seminal project. So how could Olmsted, who so forcefully championed justice for black Americans and condemned the hypocrisy of Northern racism, play a part in removing this remarkable black community? Put simply, as a matter of timing and circumstance, Olmsted was not involved in the decision to locate the park centrally and thus displace this community. In 1852, as debates over the park's location intensified, Olmsted was in the South, studying slavery and observing black communities struggle for self-determination. On July 21, 1853 specifically, the day New York lawmakers finalized the Central Park Act, Olmsted was returning from Rochester, where he visited the National Colored Convention and was inspired by Frederick Douglass's call for full rights. While Seneca Village residents fought city assessments in December 1853, Olmsted published the Fair Play for the Negro article in the New York Daily Times. By 1855, as eviction notices went out, he was immersed in research for his second book in a trilogy, A Journey in the Southern Slave States. Olmsted's notes reveal that he strongly disapproved of the site selection for Central Park. He attributed the park's central location to its political corruption and personal grudges rather than careful planning, calling it an afterthought. chosen to gratify an alderman's jealousy. In draft memoir notes, he mocked the decision as haphazard, depicting it as one man simply pointing to the middle of the island on a map with no regard for suitability. He basically said there wasn't a worse 840 acres on Manhattan Island that you could have picked. Olmsted insisted on the Jones Wood location on the East River. He believed it would have been superior, and later wrote that no other track could have been less naturally suited, suited to a park or require more labor and expense to improve. While he oversaw Central Park's construction, his writings show a clear understanding that the site was chosen politically, not practically, and that it came at the expense of a thriving Black community. Notably absent from the back and forth between the Jones Wood location on the East River and the Central Park location options are the vital perspectives of 1,600 people who lived in the boundaries of the future park. Large swaths of New York's population did not have the right to vote at the time. All women, most Black men, unless you owned property, and some immigrant men. If their perspectives had been accounted for, as Sara Zewde Miller writes in her book Before Central Park, they may have come to express that the land others were proposing to become a peaceful refuge already was one. Central Park stands as a symbol of many firsts for the nation, as well as the discipline of landscape architecture. Among them was the legal framework it inaugurated through the removal of Seneca Village, the first instance of the removal of an established community for the purpose of constructing a park. After Central Park, cities across the United States pursued park improvement projects that enabled the displacement of communities of color, largely Black communities, through the Jim Crow era and into today. The seeming benevolence of parks made them an especially insidious and effective tool, one that intertwined the growth of landscape architecture with the destruction of Black urban life. The gentle language of landscape, trees, hills, fresh air, masked the violence of forced removal. As part of my research, I retraced Olmsted's steps through the South. This is a map showing just the breadth of his travels overlaid onto the drawing that he made with Goodloe. And I largely followed his itinerary across the southern seaboard slave states. So I'll just quietly share some of the images from the trip and talk a little bit about some of the reflections that visiting those places inspired. In the book, I go through each one of the states and each one of the sites and kind of talk about what he witnessed and what I witnessed. This is a space in Richmond, Virginia, where Olmsted witnessed the burial of a young Black child. And as he's describing it, he's describing this rolling topography, and he kind of cites it loosely. And it was enough information for me to kind of triangulate and figure out where he was. But as I was looking around, I couldn't find this large burial ground that he described, or the rolling topography. And then I realized it was underneath this freeway. A number of the plantations that Olmsted visited today function as prisons. This is a square in Savannah, Georgia. Olmsted did actually, early on in his trip, he started to understand the significance of Black burial grounds as places of momentary freedom for enslaved people. And this is another burial ground that he spent quite a bit of time in. And of course, but when he visited in 1853, it was considered the outskirts of Savannah. But today it's considered part of the historic core of the city. And, it's another one of those instances, this kind of, striking dissonance between what he saw and what I saw. I mean, he saw a burial ground with, marble and stone, various stone headstones and inscriptions, and was really taken with how much care visibly there was in this black burial ground. And of course, upon my visit, I was struggling to understand the relationship between a park, a nice, square, and the burial ground. And I spent the day there, and I spoke to a number of people who lived in the vicinity and walked to the park, and some of them had been there for a couple of generations, and I tried to tell them about my research, and of course they were like, "Oh, Olmsted, Central Park. Of course we know. What does he have to do with Savannah?" And I told them he visited here. It was a burial ground, and none of the residents knew that there are people interred thousands below our feet. But there's a housing project not far from here. Many of the residents are black. I spoke with them, and they all knew the story. They didn't know Olmsted, but they knew that this was a burial ground, and they told me that all of the trees in that park know. And they also pointed me to where I might be able to find those headstones. Olmsted actually transcribed word for word the headstones, and so I was able to take his text and look for the headstones. And so there's a burial ground on the other side of town, literally the other side of the train tracks, low-lying land, and found them underneath. And for me, retracing his steps across the South and to come really face to face with materially something that he touched and wrote and spent time with, and to find it in this condition, not because he touched it, but because of the thousands of people whose souls rest. And it's a big question about actually, where are they? Are they there? Most people believe that the majority of the interred still rest under the park, and just a few select moved. But the headstones are basically, laying underneath a layer of dirt. So here we are, inching towards 2 centuries from both the date of this singular volume, The Cotton Kingdom, as well as Central Park. They both survived, and they both remain as an index for us to measure our evolution. In the generations since, the tools of mine and Olmsted's profession have been weaponized to operationalize native land dispossession, historical revisionism, segregation, and beyond, basically to untell the stories that Olmsted wanted to tell about America. And yet, I still believe in landscape architecture. It is precisely those failings of both the profession and the nation that make Olmsted worth continuing to write about, and landscape architecture worth continuing to do. I believe that public space can play a central role in the project of democracy, but in order for us to do so, we must claim a fuller history of the profession and use the vehicle of public space towards the aim of redress, as Olmsted proposed we do, and we still can. Thank you. So I believe we have a few minutes for Q&A.
Oh, thank you. I didn't quite understand in the very beginning how, when you got this assignment, what this committee was looking for in choosing a landscape architect. What do you think they were hoping to do, and were the other candidates similar ilk?
He wasn't a landscape architect yet, but he had written a book called Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England. It was basically a friend of a friend. He wasn't up against anyone. It was basically, Henry Raymond was a family friend of Charles Loring Brace, who was a childhood friend of Olmsted's, college-age friend. And so he was recommended based on the fact that, just personal recommendation. And then he had, as I mentioned, this book that he'd already written, which was written in this kind of travelogue writing style. So that was all he had on his resume for the most part that was relevant to the gig, but he got it.
Please wait for the microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. Where is it? It's back here, but you can have it after me. Thank you. I'm Rachel. I'm a landscape architect myself, so I'm really excited. And I did some of my thesis work on similar work, but I think that your talk is making me think about how people say that Prospect Park is like a more successful park, right? And first of all, maybe that question is like totally futile. I've had that thought, like, why does this even matter? But then now I'm kind of wondering, like, is it actually that Prospect Park is more socially, like I was thinking about it in terms of its spatial qualities, but the way you're framing this conversation makes me think about the actual social qualities that make Prospect Park what it is. So do you have any insight into that comparison?
I agree with you. People love that conversation. I don't find it very relevant to my research question. I mean, Prospect Park wasn't so much, it was his next big commission, so there wasn't that much time in between the two. Very different circumstances in terms of where they sit in his biography. I really focus on Central Park because of its relationship to it is the hinge between his dedicated travel to the South and then his profession of landscape architecture. His views roughly change. From Central Park towards over the course of his career, he does become a little bit more influenced by the idea of the existing conditions and working with the existing conditions of the site. So that's something that shifts as he moves from Central Park to Prospect Park. From Prospect Park, later, he really starts to think about parks as systems more so, and Prospect Park you can kind of think of as a hinge between his thinking about parks as really distinct spaces and more as larger systems, like in Buffalo. And so Prospect Park's geometry in his mind lends itself a little bit more to that idea that a park can extend into the reaches of this neighborhood fabric in a way that a rectangle can't. But my focus is primarily on Central Park.
No, I'm not going to ask my question.
I want to hear it now.
Well, in pursuing your great interest, it seems daunting if you're working alone. Are you coordinating a team with you?
In my writing or in my practice?
In your practice, I assume you're still going after a lot of these places that need to be discovered and then repurposed.
Yeah, I have 15 people in my office. We have a studio in Harlem, and we're working all over the world. I focused this on this is not my day job at all. This is a side hustle. I have a day job. I run a practice I entered landscape architecture before I ever knew about Olmsted's relationship to the South. I often say that I entered into landscape architecture despite itself. I always felt like I felt like I could do something with the tools that maybe I didn't really see in the practice. And so after building up this research about Olmsted's original ambitions, it really emboldened my own practice of landscape architecture and has energized me and made me feel like this profession can have something to say about the biggest challenges facing our society. And if we understand that this is the origin of the profession, then we might all be more emboldened to ask more of our civic spaces. I'm glad you asked me your question.
Sarah, I just think your research and pulling this together is just brilliant and a wonderful thing. I too discovered this about Olmsted after I had chosen a profession, but what it did for me was to justify my participation in a profession of landscape architecture many years ago, probably before you were born, I thought of.
I'm older than I look, I was gonna say.
But, and I just discovered it with Dr. Albert Fine when he was teaching at Harvard. And it really did, for me, to justify a profession that when I went to school, it was golf courses and luxury housing and subdivisions, things that in my mind did not relate to who I was as a black woman and one who had grown up in the South. My question to you, though, is in actually reading the book and doing research, I felt that, of course, as a social scientist, and that's what he said he was to be, or that's how he defined himself, and a gardener as a personal, he did not seem to me to relate directly to the blacks that he ran into, but in describing them, but it was really more of a scientific review. And, although, he was his own belief in being a liberal and he was doing the right thing, but it was what I found it to be an arm's length and a scientific.
Yeah.
And I don't know, if in your other research, but I just never, and working at the house, or I just didn't have any sense, as most people in this country had a direct relationship with black people. And I'm very happy that, he did the work with Frederick Douglass, but it wasn't a personal kind of, it was more of a scientific, I thought, but I just want to hear your views on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And something I definitely go into in the book, actually. He's writing contemporaneously. Before he goes to the South, he has had no physical contact with slavery, really. And so the writing that he does contemporaneously as he's traveling indexes that change in his views. He's very naive in the beginning. And so after writing that, he then decides he wants to rewrite that work in a different voice, and he writes the trilogy. Fast forward another 5 years, he doesn't believe he's written it well enough, and he comes back and he writes it again in this book, in the Cotton Kingdom. And he writes an intro addressing his voice in the previous publications, and essentially edits out a lot of previously held beliefs, changes wording. No matter what he does, it is always that. That is something that I talk about in the book, that for him, black people were biologically equal, but he never really puts them in a position of being the source of any meaningful imagination. This is the English picturesque, and everyone deserves to have access to our culture. And that is the civilizing force. He doesn't really, the way that he writes about Native people is much worse. There is just no grappling with legacies of Native land. And so there's actually very problematic writing, particularly actually about black women. And that's something that I go into. So I'm not here to defend him in any way. I think he's a problematic figure. And people always want to say, well, he was ahead of his time. He was radical. I don't think black people being free is a radical idea. I don't care what year it was. But it needs to also be documented that he did say that. So there's a lot of really horrible writing. And so I'm not shying away from that in my research.
On one of the maps that you had up there with Central Park in the middle, and you said some people wanted it to be over on the East River, and there was a big chunk of land there. What is that today?
Anyone live in that rectangle? Oh, here, yeah. So Jones, when the original idea of a large park in New York City, this was legislated as the site of New York City's large park, and the benefit of it was owned by one family, the Jones family, and it was already being maintained and designed. It was already designed and maintained as a kind of roughly English picturesque landscape. People also talked about the benefits to being on the river, romanticizing the idea of sunrise and like breezes, and everyone was on board. This is what our large park was supposed to be. And it really came down to wealthy landowners uptown who wanted the removal of people that Seneca Village was not a squatter community. Seneca Village was a legitimate landowning community. They bought their parcels of land, but there were also squatters in the southern portions of the reaches of the park. But wealthy landowners did want the removal of people living in what is now Central Park. And there was a lot of land speculation happening. And so the process towards making Jones Park happen was very far down the road. And it was a late switch to move towards the Central Park idea. So this was, in a parallel universe. We're talking about Jones Park right now.
Hi, I'm an aspiring landscape architect, but have had a lot of misgivings about the field for reasons that you've mentioned. And I was wondering in what ways you or other people in the practice have been asking more of civic space or using it as redress in the way that you've mentioned.
Yeah. Well, I think there's so many ways to answer that question. I don't think Olmsted was necessarily a North Star. I don't think that's the future. It shouldn't be. It's literally the past. So, but it is perhaps a foundation to build on. And I think, Olmsted was so committed to the idea of democracy. I think aspects of democratic process can be integrated into the process of design. So in my own practice, we do a lot of community engagement work. For people who have been a victim of decades of really bad urban policy that landscape architects have been implicated in, the idea of trust is important, I think, to making large-scale civic works in people's neighborhoods. Parks are also large generators of wealth. Some of the most valuable real estate in New York City is near Central Park. And so when we build parks in certain places, that's also a way to generate wealth for people that have historically been excluded from those opportunities. So I'm really interested also in the idea of parks working together with policymakers to fashion, mechanisms like community land trusts, or organizing people around understanding how to see, the capture of the wealth generated in your home values. And Olmsted does model that in a sense that he's engaged in policy. He's working with civic leaders. It's not, making parks for him is not just saying, give me the boundaries of the park and I'll tell you where to put the paths and the plants. For him, it really is a way of working, a way of designing that is really hand in hand with large city making and policy making. And so I think that should be understood as core skills to the practice of landscape architecture. So thinking more expansively in that way. I also think, I one of the things I say in the book is that I don't see his writing just as a historical document. It is a methodological proposition. And the way he's understanding places, both as physical sites, but also, the ecological underpinnings, the economic underpinnings, the socio-political factors that make physical spaces what they are, is a way of understanding our own sites that I think is relevant. So it's a way of analyzing. It's not just site analysis, like, okay, it's this much grade change across the site. Really, like, what happened here? What is it a function of? What are the factors that I'm working within? And beauty plays a role here. I'm overcorrecting a bit because I think people look at Central Park and the parks Olmsted's made and see them as these beautiful spaces, and they are. But beauty is political. And it doesn't mean that I love beauty, and there's a reason why I entered into this field, and that is because of, the way I feel when I'm in beautiful places that make me feel affirmed to be in a certain place, that I'm welcome there, and that there is a kind of a quality of life that everybody deserves access to.
That sounds like a wonderful place to wrap this up. Thank you so much, Sarah.